Welcome to another exciting episode of the Scrum Life podcast. Today we have a special guest joining us, Patty Aluskewicz, an Agile coach and the host of Agile Conversations. I couldn't be more thrilled to have Patty on the show as she brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in the Agile world, and she's here to share her incredible career journey with all of us. What makes Patty's story even more fascinating is that her journey began in the education sector, where she started her career as a teacher. However, she took a leap of faith and successfully transitioned into the tech field, eventually becoming an Agile coach. This transformation is truly inspiring, and I believe her insights will be invaluable for anyone who's considering a career transition or looking to dive deeper into the world of Agile. So without further ado, let's welcome Patty to the Scrum Life podcast. Patty, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here, and we can't wait to learn more from your experiences and wisdom.
Yes, thank you so much for having me today.
Thanks, Patty. I'd love to start off with you telling us a little bit more about yourself and your career journey.
Yeah, it's been a long one, but in some respects, it's happened so quickly. As you mentioned, I started off my career as a science teacher. So I went to college to get my science degree in geology. I was really fascinated about science and the natural world and understanding how the earth worked. As that passion further developed in college, I decided to then go get my master's in education because I wanted to share that information with the world. I decided to go into what some people thought was crazy, go into middle school and teach middle schoolers. I guess at that level, it's a combination of science. And luckily with my bachelor's degree, I took all the types of science: physics, chemistry, biology, and of course, geology. I graduated with my master's and I moved to Atlanta. Big change from Boston, Massachusetts for me. So not only a cultural change, but definitely a shift in my perceptions on what the realities of are in the teaching world. I went to a very progressive research university, Harvard University, and they taught us really how to teach outside the box. A lot of it was theory. And when I got into the classroom, I didn't quite understand how to implement it. So instead of doing, inquiry-based learning, which I had learned in graduate school, I fell into that command and control type teacher situation, because all of a sudden you're in front of 20 plus middle schoolers and you feel out of control. What I realized was they weren't that interested in listening to me talk about science all day, and I had to figure out a different way to run my classroom. At the time, I just started reaching back into what I learned in my graduate degree, which is taking myself out of the center of the classroom and making them responsible for their own learning. And all these years later, which at this point is a couple of decades, I realized that's where my Scrum and Agile journey began. So when people ask, how did you transition from teaching into being an Agile coach? It really started there over 20 years ago. So I took a big leap of faith in running my classroom a very different way, but it was also a transformation. So when we talk about Agile transformation, taking a company and moving it from waterfall to Agile, I had to do the same thing in my classroom. And it took a couple of months to shift to a new way of working, so to speak. But once I did it, I never looked back. And what I noticed was students were much more engaged. They did relish in taking responsibility for their own learning. And it took a lot of pressure off of me to be the end all be all of all knowledge. They got to discover things for themselves. And again, looking back, at that time, this was in the early 2000s, I didn't know what Agile and Scrum was at all. And most of the world didn't either. So when I broke up my units into smaller chunks and assigned points to each assignment and allowed them to complete it at their own pace and calculate their velocity and whatever terms I called it, everything directly translated into what I do as an Agile coach, and of course, what Scrum teams do today. And it wasn't until many years later that I started studying Scrum and Agile, this is in the mid 2000s at this point. Let's say 2017, 18, around then, that I really understood what I was doing all those years ago. So with that being said, I was operating in an island of my own. Nobody knew what I was doing. They didn't care. They knew I was getting, great results on my report cards, and the students were obviously much more engaged as people peeked in my classroom, but nobody really asked me anything about it. They weren't interested because they were just doing their thing. And although I pushed it as far as I could, I was still accountable to the standardized test scores. I still had administrators coming to me and saying, well, it's great what you're doing in your classroom, but you're going to have to answer to those scores if they're not good at the end of the year. And although, I did as much as I could, I felt like I pushed it to the limit, and I decided to change careers at that point. And that was about 9 years after I had started my teaching career that I left, and I went into business. It's a big career shift. All of a sudden, wasn't dealing with kids anymore. I was dealing with adults. My husband at the time opened a business, a brick and mortar business, and I joined him to actually run the business while he was the service provider. So I had to very quickly learn about how a business runs. And I mean, it was such a learning journey for me over the next 8 years in how to start, scale, hire people, manage business operations, run marketing campaigns. I mean, you name it, I did it. And it was definitely on a small business level. But what it's translated for me as I work in the corporate space now is I have much more understanding and empathy for what the other roles do in the organization. Had I not had that business experience, I wouldn't have that perspective. So once that business relationship ran its course and we went our separate ways, I had to figure out what I wanted to do next. And at the time I was teaching yoga. I had a very deep spiritual yoga practice. And I also had, so it was kind of like a small business myself. And I also had an e-commerce business creating and selling yoga jewelry. And I had to teach myself so many things because business had changed between 2006 and 2014. All of a sudden, everybody was online. And I had to learn how to create a website. And I had to learn how to do social media marketing. And I had to learn how to do all these things that we didn't have to do in our previous business. So I got that type of perspective. And again, I pushed that as far as I could, and that kind of ran its course. And then that's kind of where I fell into Scrum mastering. Now, you might ask, well, if I have no software background, how did I get that experience? And that is often what people ask me. And it's because in the original first business that I opened with my husband at the time, we decided to create custom software to run our business. There was nothing out there at the time. We hired local developers, and I was put in charge of it because there was no one else. So I quickly had to figure out how to build software. And although I did none of the coding, we hired people to do that, I had to do all of the rest of it. So it was quasi-project management, quasi-Scrum, but these software developers worked in iterative cycles. And this is where I learned more deeper about the Scrum practices. And I started reading about it. And I started learning about the Scrum events. So it's kind of like everything has put itself in my career path for a reason. And I just had to be open to take those steps. And eventually, I got a job as a Scrum Master in a startup here in Charlotte. I worked and kind of honed my chops in that smaller environment. And then I took a leap into a larger environment, which is the corporate environment that I'm in today.
That's really amazing. Yeah, thanks for going through the whole career transition. It sounds like you have a lot of experience in all different industries and backgrounds. I'm curious to know what made you transition, and I know some of it was shifting from like a business area to another, maybe more of the tech industry. What made you decide, okay, I want to be a Scrum Master versus all of the other things that you had done in your previous experience?
Well, I think it started out when I was a classroom teacher. I was essentially a Scrum Master. I almost said managing. I'll get like strung up by the Agile community for saying that. But, we manage a classroom, right? I was managing basically mini Scrum teams.
That's awesome. And was it anything in particular about I mean, I know you spoke to some of this. You said that you noticed changes in how they were operating, they were more self-organizing, but was there like one particular thing, or was it just the overall process that, because it sounds like you had so many options into the different fields or areas you could go into. Was it anything in particular that you really enjoyed about Scrum or being a Scrum master that you decided, okay, I'm going to make a career out of this?
I think it was such a gradual process that I never really thought about it. It wasn't an intentional decision.
That
And
makes
that's
sense.
something that I want to talk about specifically, because, as you and I both work with people that are making an intentional decision to make a career switch, what I did was not intentional. I think it was, I just moved from role to role, from industry to company, picking up skills along the way. And eventually somebody said to me, it sounds like you're a Scrum Master. You should just apply for a Scrum Master job at a company. And I said, are you
Awesome.
sure? Because, I don't really have the job title.
Yeah.
And I don't really, quote unquote, have the experience on my resume. My resume is kind of like at the time, I looked at it as a mishmash of stuff. But I just had to learn how to reframe it and then sell and market who I was to make people believe that's what I was doing.
That makes
And that
sense.
was a mindset shift that I had to have.
Yeah. I think it's pretty funny that you say that, because I would say I'm similar to you in that fact with transitioning into the Scrum Master role. Is I never really set out intentionally, like even when I got my certification, I didn't set out to say, oh, I'm going to be a Scrum Master now. I was more so just interested in the theory and getting a better understanding. I was actually a business analyst at the time, and it was just one of those things. Yeah, I was trying out different skills, trying out different roles, and then eventually I got into that role and then realized, okay, well, I want to be a little bit more intentional. I enjoy doing this and leading a team. And that's when I started applying for Scrum Master roles. And it sounds like maybe you experienced something similar to me, or what some of our listeners might be experiencing is a little bit of imposter syndrome, or wondering, okay, I don't have this official title. So what were some of the things that you did? Would you say that you experienced a little bit of self-doubt? And if so, how did you overcome that?
Yeah, that was really tough. I think a lot of that, going back to my teaching career, a lot of that self-doubt was fomented in the classroom because, and some of your listeners that are teachers or have left that profession understand, you have to answer to so many different people and everybody has a different expectation of you, and you try to please all people and be all things to everybody. And that's especially true for teachers because you're dealing with children and building their knowledge. And they, of course, then it's always, they have to pass the test. So you better be doing a good job. So there's a lot to balance there. And I think a lot of teachers get very, very frustrated because they feel like they are not good enough. And that bleeds out into whatever you do after that. And you have to do a lot of hard work to undo that. Being confident in yourself and your skill sets and believing that you can do something else besides teaching. That was something that I had to overcome. I think it was, I won't say easier for me, but because I started my own business after that, I didn't have to go out and interview and get somebody to
Right.
hire me, right? But I still had to overcome that fear of, I don't know how to talk to adults. I don't know how to get them to see me as an authority because they had so many problems with what I was doing over the 9 years that I was a teacher.
Okay.
So what I intentionally did there at that career junction was I went out and I joined Toastmasters. I was proactive. I said, I know I have to deal with the adult public now, and interacting with them and probably educating them about the products and services, etc., that I need to be confident. And I made a beeline for Toastmasters in Charlotte, and I breezed through the entire manual because that was my mission, to become a better public speaker in front of adults. When I transitioned, so if we fast forward a little bit, when I transitioned to becoming a yoga instructor, yes, I had teaching experience. It was good because I was now teaching adults, so I had that experience, right? That wasn't my issue at that point. It was, I had this whole entire class sequence memorized in my brain. I better trust that it's going to come out, and it's going to come out in the order that I need it to come out so I don't confuse all the people in front of me. And in teaching yoga for 5 years, it helped me become present and realize I got to stop thinking about 5 minutes from now, 10 minutes from now, 3 hours from now. I got to focus on what I do in this exact moment. Because if I'm saying one thing and thinking something else, I end up saying what I'm thinking. And that could be a big mess when you're saying, move your right foot here and pick up your left arm and like start turning around, facing different directions. So you have to be very present. But then fast forwarding into, making that leap into becoming a Scrum Master for a startup, I think for me, it was fortunate that I built the relationships here in Charlotte, that the people that I was interacting with were very clear as to what my skills were, what my experience was. And they felt like even though I didn't have the tech background, that I had everything else. And they encouraged me to go for it. And I did. But then when I made the jump to corporate America, as I mentioned before, my resume was kind of a mishmash of everything. And even though I had Scrum Master official experience, I still didn't feel like it counted. And in some respects, I was sort of told that by recruiters, specifically in talking to them over and over and over. You don't have this, you don't check this box, you don't have a tech background, you don't have corporate America experience, you don't have whatever their lingo was, large matrix, blah, blah, blah experience. And I finally had to get to the point where I was confident and say, it doesn't matter. Let me tell you what I do have.
I love
and
that.
let me tell you why I'm the perfect person to help you solve your problems.
Do you feel like that was kind of the turning point for you when you were transitioning careers? I think that's something that so many people struggle with when they're transitioning is, well, I don't have the tech experience. I don't have this. I love the fact that you turned it around and you said, this is what I do have. Did you feel that once you started having those conversations, you started lining up more opportunities?
Absolutely. It was like, I would say, I'm not going to say it happened overnight, but I would say after trying for like 3 or 4 months to land job interviews, it was like I landed job interviews and nothing had changed. I still had the same experience. I still had the same knowledge inside of me. It was all about how I spoke about myself. And I think what pushed me over, like I said, it took about a month, but what really kind of pushed me over the edge there is I started posting content on LinkedIn.
Okay. That's
And
great.
that's where I had to push myself out of my comfort zone into this invisible audience of who knows who was reading it. And I had to get confident in speaking about Scrum and Agile. And I said to myself, if nobody will give me an interview, I'm going to speak about who I am and somebody's going to find me. And that's exactly what happened.
That's
Somebody
amazing.
reached out to me that I hadn't spoken to from Toastmasters, by the way, in 10 years. I hadn't spoken to this person. He's like, I saw you, like what you're up to on LinkedIn. He introduced me to a recruiter and that recruiter became my advocate.
That's
Right.
amazing.
It's like that sponsorship, right? That sponsorship where somebody opens the door and says, you need to give this woman a chance. And the recruiter pushed for me. I got the interview, the corporate interview. That's where I had all that practice up until that point in speaking about myself and being confident and like, I can do this. It caused me to nail that interview and I got the job.
That's awesome. It sounds like it was probably a couple of things too, because do you feel like it was also a mindset shift for you where you were, or do you feel like you already had a pretty good mindset? It was more so just in terms of how you were talking about yourself and marketing yourself?
I think the mindset, as cliche as this sounds, it's the foundation of everything. Because if you are thinking, I can't do this, or I don't have the skills, or I've never worked in corporate America, or whatever it is, you are going to then speak about yourself with those things in mind. And that's exactly what I was doing. And once it was like I don't want to say like I hit rock bottom because that wasn't it, but I just became determined. I've got to change this because the problem here is me. And it was a shift in mindset. And I just started talking about myself in a very different way. And it was uncomfortable at first, but I had to get over it. And I had to advocate for myself because I realized nobody was going to advocate for me.
I love that. Thanks for sharing that experience. So I wanted to talk a little bit too about once you were actually in the Scrum Master role, It sounded like it was a little bit of a struggle when you first started out, maybe not as a Scrum Master, but transitioning into working with adults. What strategies did you use to try to build relationships or make sure that you were fulfilling your role as a Scrum Master and really helping your teams?
Yeah, I think it was, I talk about reaching back into like previous careers. It's so many of the things that I had done previously that I tapped into, that I had to tap into because I was not a software developer. In the classic sense, I don't know how to program. So I had to lean on everything else that I possibly could to make connections to get these folks to trust me so they would know that I was like legit, so to speak,
Mhm.
and I can help them, right? Because one of the biggest things is, well, they're not going to take me seriously because I can't understand what they're doing. To go back to LinkedIn, there are a lot of people out there that produce content that say you need a technical background, you need to have software development experience, and maybe I'm a purple unicorn or whatever, but I've managed to become very successful without that background. Now, I will say that it's not an excuse for me to not understand as much as I can. So I don't like dismiss that at all. But what I have found is the skills to be a Scrum Master and Agile coach are all the things that I've done previously. Teaching, how much do we have to educate our teams about Scrum and Agile? Right? I have to deliver workshops, I have to deliver trainings. And that has been a huge asset because not everybody has that skill. I used to take that for granted, but I realize some of the other Scrum Masters and Agile coaches have other skills that I don't have, but I bring that to the table. And together we are valuable as a unit. So there's that. There's teaching yoga. It's all the philosophy that I learned, which is all emotional intelligence, psychological safety, which probably sounds bizarre, but if you study yoga philosophy, it's all the same. So all these things that I learned about being vulnerable, not controlling, trying to control what's in front of me, showing up and focusing on myself and not worrying about the other person's response and taking responsibility for the other person's response to what I do. I learned all of that from yoga. So it's kind of like tapping into those things and pulling them into the software development world that has caused me to become as successful as I did. Now, if I didn't have any of that and I didn't have any software development skills, I'd be like dead in the water, right?
You're right. Yeah, that's amazing. Well, it sounds like you had so many different skills that you brought to the table at teaching. I love the fact that you went and you did Toastmasters to build your communication skills. Do you have any tips that you would give to aspiring Scrum Masters, whether they have a technical background or a non-technical background? And what would you have to say to them about using transferable skills to help them in their new role?
The first thing I would say is believe that those transferable skills are legitimate. If you look at, for example, the 6 stances of a Scrum Master, teaching is one of them. So that is something that I very much lean into. But there are also other ones like mentorship, for example. Have you mentored people? And how can you take that experience and leverage it with your teams? But the point that I want to bring up here is you have to be vulnerable and put yourself out there and practice these things. People may not ask you to do it, but it's like you have to raise your hand. And what I like to talk about is create opportunities to build your skills. For example, I run a meetup called Agile Conversations. When I started this meetup, it was an idea. I had never done a meetup before. I had never built a community before. I didn't know what to do. And I didn't even know if I could do that because I was not, quote unquote, that type of person, right? I'm this introvert. I like to talk to people one-on-one. Could I bring along a group of people and get them to follow me? I didn't know. So I had to figure out, how do I do that? So it's building the audience on LinkedIn, inviting people. You may have to invite 100 people and 20 show up. Let go of the 80 that don't. Don't worry about it. It's okay. And focus on delivering something to the 20 people that do show up. And then once, people start falling off of your meetup, well, you have to keep building up the audience to invite more people to keep that critical mass, so to speak. But again, I didn't know how to do that. And I had to just put myself out there and do it.
I love that. And I'd love to ask you a little bit more about the meetup that you started. When you first started it, what was the reason behind why you wanted to start it? And could you share a little bit more about what it is in case other people are interested in joining or knowing more about it?
Yeah. So I started this, I'm kind of like in the third iteration of it. When I originally started, it was a little over 2 years ago at this point. I just wanted to bring people together. I wanted to talk about tough conversations or tough topics. I didn't see, and again, it's crazy how things have changed in 2.5 years. But at the time, people were not talking about imposter syndrome. So I'm like, okay, let's get people together and let's talk about imposter syndrome. Let's put it out there. And that's what I did. That may be a common topic now, but that was not talked about a few years ago, and people were very uncomfortable. But I'm like, I don't care. I think this is missing from the discussion space. I'm going to figure out how to do this. And people showed up. But I had to market this. And I still do, right? Because people don't just automatically show up because I put a post on LinkedIn and say, hey, I'm doing this thing. You have to DM people, you have to build relationships, you have to constantly invite and re-invite and gather people together. And you're there to just facilitate conversation. So in essence, I was building a community, but I was also practicing my facilitation skills. How do I get comfortable with the fact that I don't know who's going to show up, what they're going to say in response? Are people going to sit there and stare at me? Is this going to be of interest to people? I had no idea, but I had to put myself out there and say, I'm determined to start this dialogue. I don't care what happens if 2 people show up. That's what it is. And eventually it just gradually built up to something much bigger. But it is something you constantly have to nourish and you have to feed, because people's attention spans are short.
I love that.
So.
It sounds like it's really paid off too. I've been to a couple of the meetups and it's really great. I love the fact that it's something different than what I've seen in other meetup groups. And the fact that you said you're having honest conversations. Has this opportunity or this group that you created other opportunities for you, or what have you really learned from that experience?
Yes, I would say it has built, I don't know what I like, this core group of people that I always lean on. And these are people that are all over the world. And we've kind of found each other, and we constantly have dialogue on LinkedIn, and we help each other out. And I would have never met any of these people had I not put myself out there and fostered these relationships with these people and continued to connect them with each other. So there's that. But the other thing I will say is that when I talk about doing this or some of the other things I've done in job interviews, hiring managers are incredibly impressed. Now, I will say, if you're on LinkedIn all the time, you might get the impression that everybody's out there running a meetup, running an email newsletter, writing, content. It's really a very small percentage of people. So while what we do is considered normal for us, in the wider Agile community, we are like 1%. So if you talk about doing these things to a hiring manager, you're like an anomaly to them. And it shows your dedication to your craft and dedication to yourself to build your skills, but also to help other people in a way that you're not just showing up for a job to collect a paycheck. So it's, like I said, it got me that job, that first corporate job, but it's gotten me clients. I mean, I've built cohorts and, trained Scrum Masters, all in a way that I would have never had that impact had I not wrote that first LinkedIn post.
That's really incredible.
And that was probably the scariest thing ever.
Is that something that you would recommend to aspiring Scrum Masters or maybe even current Scrum Masters, is trying to have more of a social media presence if they don't already?
Yeah, I think it is something you have to be mindful of, right? And I get burned out and I get tired of, and it's a commitment. But like I said, it differentiates you from everybody else. It also shows that you know something.
Right.
And recruiters are all over LinkedIn. they can very easily see that you're posting content. They can see who you are, what your experience is, what you stand for. And that inspires them to reach out and say, hey, I have a job opportunity. Are you interested?
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. That's something I try to tell clients as well, or students, is trying to build some presence. And for some people, they don't feel as comfortable. I know I have some friends that aren't as comfortable posting stuff on social media. And I'm saying things specific such as LinkedIn or Instagram. I don't think you even necessarily have to put it on the official social media sites. I think having a blog, or, I mean, of course, it's going to be easier for recruiters to find you on LinkedIn, but whether it's a YouTube channel or a blog or whatever the case may be, I think it helps you stand out as well to recruiters. And I think it's pretty interesting too that you said, to me, I think because I'm a content creator as well, it's just like I see all of these people out there, but it really is a small percentage. So it's a great way to try to stand out, because not all of the people that these recruiters are talking to are doing the same type of thing.
Right. And if you think about it in terms of numbers, right? I don't know what the official LinkedIn numbers are. They're getting close to 1 billion people. So let's call it 1 billion people. 1%. And again, that's across all industries, right? That's not just Agile. It's not, there's not like 1 billion Agilists, right? But when you talk about 1 billion people, only 1% of that are actually putting out content or even reposting anything or commenting, interacting, so to speak. It is a very small percentage. So you are, for all intents and purposes, an anomaly. But you might not get that impression, as you said, because you see the same 50 people posting things all day long. You get this impression that everybody does this.
Right. I love that. Well, another question I wanted to ask you was around if people, well, actually, as we wrap up, I wanted to ask you if people were interested in following you or connecting with you, what's the best way for them to connect?
Well, of course, LinkedIn.
Awesome.
I'm sure you'll put my name in the notes there.
I'll put all your information in the show notes so they can find you and everything as well.
Right, because as I'm very, very aware, my last name is pretty much of a mouthful, complicated one. So it's easy for people to just like click on it, right? If you include it.
Right.
But it's Patty Aluskewicz.
Okay. And for them to find your meetup, I know that they can go on LinkedIn, but how frequently do you meet? Where's the best way for them to follow or sign up for that if they wanted to attend one of your meetups?
Yes. So I do have a LinkedIn page specifically for it. It's called Agile Conversations. So they can just search for it, and I will, I approve the members. So I screen people.
Okay.
There's a lot of, fake profiles and stuff that try to join, but I do screen everybody, and I do admit people as long as they have a genuine interest in Scrum and Agile.
Awesome. I'll make sure to put that in the show notes for people as well, so it's easy for them to get access to that meetup. And before we wrapped up, I wanted to see if there's any last piece of advice or anything that you'd like to share with us before we finalize the episode for today.
I would say, we talked about so many things. I would say the one thing that we didn't get to touch on was building a network. It's critical to do that. And building a network is not, and I say this from experience, because when I had to go out and build a network, right before I got onto LinkedIn, so to speak, we were still in person. I was kind of going around in Charlotte meeting people, and I kind of looked at it as a transactional type thing where I was showing up and saying, okay, I need a job or I need an opportunity. Who do I have to meet and talk to in order to get somebody to open a door for me? I went into it from that perspective, and I found very quickly that that doesn't work. You have to offer of yourself to show these folks who are mentors and sponsors that you are serious and you want to put in the work. Because what I found, and I say this because now I'm kind of on the opposite side, I want to know the person is serious and they're committed for the long haul, which means they're going to push, they're not a flash in the pan. They want to work through really tough spots in order to keep going in this career journey. And in order for somebody to reveal themselves as that, they have to build the relationship with me. And the other folks that I have in my circle that are mentors and sponsors, it's the same thing. Build a relationship, keep showing up, and it could take 6 months before the person trusts you to open the door for you. So building a network is a long game, but it pays off in dividends later down the road when you need a job. So I would say find a group of people, build relationships with them, and keep showing up with them, and have no expectations. And things will kind of end up working out when you least expect it.
That's really great advice. Thanks for sharing that. I think a lot of people that I've talked to have that same type of perspective as well, is more of a transactional, how do I get something out of it, instead of what can I provide or how can I build a relationship. So I think that's really amazing advice for aspiring and current Scrum Masters. So thanks for sharing that. And Patty, I wanted to thank you once again for joining us today. Your career journey is truly inspiring and filled with valuable insights. I'm sure our listeners have gained a lot of practical advice and motivation to advance in their own careers. That wraps up today's episode of the Scrum Life podcast. Thank you all for tuning in, and we look forward to having you join us next time for more empowering conversations and tips to help you thrive in your career. Thank you.
Thank you.